Trying to imagine the most up, up front and the most encouraging passage of scripture that I could use for New Year's. One that sort of inspires you. And so I was directed to the book of Lamentations. Are you familiar with the book of Lamentations? Lamentations is in the Old Testament, and in case you can't find it, it's right after the book of Jeremiah and in between Jeremiah and Ezekiel. It's actually classified as one of the major prophets. It's just because you can't sort of take it out of the other, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and they got Lamentations and Ecclesiastes are thrown in there as well. I'm going to talk more about the sort of structure of the book of Lamentations in a moment. But one of the things that sort of I encounter, I was talking to my mom yesterday, just briefly, and my mom turned 90 this last year, and so she's entering her 91st year here on earth and new year. And I was trying to think of all those years that have gone by and what New Year's felt like for her in her journey. And you begin to imagine, don't you, that it's just the same old, just another year coming up, another year gone by. We just sort of grin and bear it and say, okay, what's going to happen next? Is, it's the old, been there, done that scenario, right? Hey, I've been there. Like what my mom could say, it's my 90th or 91st New Year. Been there, I've done that. I made resolutions, haven't kept them. I'm speaking for my mom there. I don't know. I will say this about my mom, though. She years ago felt really strongly compelled to read through the Bible in 1 year. So she got one of those really nice Bible through the 1 year book Bibles. And I will say that I believe my mother then, I think this was around when she was in my age now, she was in her 60s when she decided to do this. I believe that over the years she has read through the Bible 14 times. And so I was pretty impressed by that, and that she has that as her, and I might be a little bit wrong on that number, but I don't think I'm far off. She was very consistent in doing that. That was a really good example to me. Hey, listen, I can make some decisions now that I'm 63 that, it's not same old. I can try something or do something different. So why are we then in the book of Lamentations? Because Lamentations seems to be a book, one, that we're not very familiar with, and two, that sometimes we just avoid because it really is a downer, right? That's the name of the book, right? I am lamenting. I am going through a very difficult time. And in this, in particular, when we get to the book of Lamentations, and most people think that Jeremiah wrote Lamentations. We're not entirely 100% sure, but most people think that he wrote Lamentations, and that it may have been a collection of lamentations that he was familiar with. If you're not familiar with the Hebrew idea of lament, it's not new here in the book of Lamentations. This isn't the only book in the Bible where you have this sort of looking inside and saying these really difficult things. The book of Psalms has 5 clear lamentations. It's Psalm 10, Psalm 63, Psalm 69, Psalm 74, and Psalm 79. Those are all very clearly psalms of lament. And one of the things that we struggle with when it comes to laments is that we want everything to be resolved. We grew up with watching half-hour television shows where no matter what the dilemma was, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, those sitcoms that came on that we were all so familiar with, no matter how difficult the circumstance was, everything was resolved and everybody was happy after 30 minutes. That's just the way that we've been designed. And so we read Psalms that way too. We love the Psalms that are happy and joyful and exciting. And we don't like the Psalms, and these Psalms of lament, I'm going to guess, don't make it on many people's favorite Psalm lists because they don't resolve. There's no resolution at the end that says, oh, but God, you're great anyways, right? They just end, they start kind of morose and they end morose, and that's just the way they are. Then the book of Lamentations, right from it's 5 chapters in Lamentations, right from 1 to 5, with one exception, which we're going to talk about today. With one exception, these are a litany of misery. Now here's the background. Of course, knowing the history of the people of Israel, there were certain times when lamenting or writing the book of Lamentations was just a natural outflow of what was going on, because the people of Israel had been through, obviously, an incredibly difficult time. This was written after the people of Israel had been removed from the land of Israel. They had been removed from Jerusalem, the holy city. The temple had been destroyed. Everything that they knew for generation after generation after generation, for hundreds of years, had been taken from them. And not only that, they were themselves taken from the land and taken into captivity in Babylon. Not a very happy time. And so the book of Lamentations then is a record of how they felt during that time. And what's really, I think, fascinating about some of the scriptures that we come to, but in the book of Lamentations, we have, if you have it open in front of you, and we're not going to go into great detail on this morning, except to say, if you look at chapter 1 of Lamentations, it has 22 verses. If you look at chapter 2 of Lamentations, it has 22 verses. If you look at chapter 3, it has way more than that, but that's beside the point. 66 verses there. Chapter 4 has 22 verses, and chapter 5 has 22 verses as well. And these are all done in the form of an acrostic using the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters. And they take the first letter and the first word of each verse, or in this particular case, stanza, or whatever you want to call it, begins with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The second one does it as well. There's a couple of Psalms that do this famously as well, most famously, I suppose, Psalm 119. But Lamentations is designed this way. And an acrostic taking the letters, it's like if you took my name and, Kevin, and you said K is for keen, E is for energetic, V is for victorious. I mean, that's how you do an acrostic, right? That's exactly what they do in the book of Lamentations. You have within the book of Lamentations one lamentation after another. Chapter 1 is one that holds together. Chapter 2 is another one. Chapter 4, chapter 5, they're both sort of a litany of lamenting. Usually talking about things that are happening to us. And here's what's great about lamenting, and why I think it is a lost art for us. Because we feel that if somebody is lamenting, all we need to do is just cheer them up, right? Why are you lamenting? Here, let me help you so that you're not lamenting anymore. But lamenting is a very good thing for us as believers to do, especially when we suffer. You hear that? Especially when we suffer. Here's 3 things that happen in a lament that are really helpful for us. Here's how they can show up. First, it can be a form of protest. Horrible things that are happening in this world. God, I'm not happy. This is, lamenting is us talking to God, by the way, just so we know, make sure we know what we're doing here. It's a form of protest. God, why are all these terrible things happening? What is going on in this world? And, what is happening here? What is going on? And for the people of Israel, that's a legitimate question. God, why is all this happening? And I'm not happy about this. In fact, I'm quite upset about this. I used to live in Jerusalem. Now I live in Babylon. I can't do the things I used to do. Everything that I know has been destroyed, and the world is in a terrible place, and we feel like we're pawns in this big game of chess, and we have no control over anything that's going on. Second thing about laments is that it is a really good way for us to process our emotion. Because honestly, for many of these people, and you know what? Some of the people that were picked up by the Babylonians and carted off, to Babylon. They were innocent in this regard. They were faithful, God-following, God-honoring people. And yet, because of the sin of some of their friends and neighbors, and because of the sin of previous generations, God was judging them. And you can imagine then that there would be some form of righteous anger and dismay that at the sin that had brought all of this about. And when we look at the world around us today and we see the results of sin in not only the way the world lives, but what is honored and lifted up in this world is not good stuff. And yet we need to be able to process that. And that's why laments are good. And it's also a place for us to voice confusion, because here's what suffering does. Suffering always brings questions. Why am I suffering? Why is my loved one suffering? Why are there a certain group of people who are suffering? And it's a great place to voice that confusion and say, God, I don't understand. And I believe that lamenting, I think it's a sacred moment. It brings a sacred dignity to human suffering. And I think lamenting is okay. Now, I'm not going to go through the book of Lamentations and record and give you a litany of all the misery that is going on. But I do encourage you to pick it up and to read it and to hear the deep felt emotion that these people are walking through. Lord, what in the world is going on? Why has this happened? Why has this occurred? Only once in these entire 5 chapters, only once do we get a ray of sunshine. And I'm not focusing on that today simply because that you can always find something good and something bad. That's not what I'm doing here this morning. What I'm saying is that only once, and it happens to be right in the middle of the book, do we find any form of God, you're at work still, and I trust you. Do we find any sense or form of hope? And I believe that that's by design. And the reason it's put in the middle of the book, in the middle of chapter 3 of the 5 chapters, is because that's how God designs it. We have lamenting here, we have lamenting here, but in the middle, we always know that God is with us and that God is taking care of us. And I want to read these verses for you now. It's Lamentations chapter 3, starting in verse 20. Now I can go back to verse 19. And you will hear in verse 19, part of the lamenting. I remember, the author says here, my affliction and my wandering and the bitterness and the gall. Verse 20, I will remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. And then verse 21, yet, he says this, I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Verse 22, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, and therefore I will wait for him. And then verse 25, the Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. And those are the verses that in the middle of this lament, this long lament, that give us that sense of hope. Because the author here, most likely Jeremiah, says in the middle of all this, there's a truth that is absolute truth, no matter what happens in this world. And that truth, that absolute truth, is that God has promised that he will never leave us, that he will never forsake us. That even in the deepest valleys that we walk through, God is there with us. And we find hope in that truth and in that truth alone, that God will never leave us or forsake us. Now we know that that was ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ, that he was the one who came in the midst of the darkness in this world to bring the good news that we've just celebrated through the Christmas season. The Lord is good to those who hope in him. Now, when I read those verses, did you recognize them at all? Did you recognize perhaps a song or a hymn that you have heard in the past? Especially verses 22 and 23. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Are you familiar with the hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness? It's a wonderful, wonderful hymn, written just, well, at the beginning of the 1900s, so it's not an ancient hymn. In hymnology, it's actually more recent. But the author of this poem, a guy by the name of Thomas Chisholm, who wrote thousands and thousands of poems. He was a guy who was called into ministry, but he had very poor health. But he did have the strength to be able to write, and he wrote poem after poem after poem. He wrote this poem, and then he gave it to a friend who then put it to music, which has become down to us as Great is Thy Faithfulness. And the chorus goes, Great is Thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see, and all I have needed Thy hand hath provided. Great is Thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Which is a complete reflection and deep meditation upon these words in the middle of the book of Lamentations, where the author here says, the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. I love the verses of Great is Thy Faithfulness because he reflects upon the character of God, and not only just the character of God, but some of his great character, great identity. We have Great is Thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. There is no shadow of turning with Thee. You change not, your compassions, they fail not. As you have been, you forever will be. That's what the author of Lamentations says. Here's the part I like in the second verse. Summer and winter and springtime and harvest, sun, moon, and stars in their courses above, join with all nature in manifold witness to thy great faithfulness, mercy, and love. And he has taken the idea that God will always accomplish what he wants to do, and yet he does it for all eternity. And that's why I love that verse, summer and winter and springtime and harvest. And then the last one, peace, pardon for sin, and a peace that endureth, thine own dear presence, to cheer and to guide, strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow, blessings all mine with 10,000 beside it. Words that we are very, very familiar with. And the author of Lamentations hits upon a note that is so wonderful for us when he says, you provide your mercies every morning. They are new every morning. Every morning. That if we just turn our heart towards God, and as the author here says, if I just sit quietly and wait, I will hear the voice of God reaffirming this truth in my life. It is new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I don't know if you're like me. I suppose that in some ways we all identify with this. I know I do. It is really easy for me to get discouraged. Like, I can have a wonderful day, and then one little thing can happen, and I find myself immediately way down here. I can have the most incredible day, and I can just be out praising God, and I see God at work doing things, and then I hear, and sometimes it's not what somebody says, it's just a stupid thought that comes into my head that takes me in another completely different direction. I don't know if you're like me or not in that regard. This is how we are sometimes. And yet the truth And I think a really wonderful truth for us at the beginning here, January 1st, 2023, is for us to be able to say, God, thank you for being with me all the time and never leaving me, even when I feel like I'm walking through this deep valley. Thank you for always being with me. Thank you that you love me so much, that you are willing to provide newness in my life every single day. You know, I don't want to talk about my mom and dad too terribly much, except to say this, that even though their lives have become not what they dreamed of in these last number of years, even though they're struggling physically and a little bit mentally and having difficulty with the stuff that they never struggled with before, hearing and mobility and all the things that many of us struggle with, that they have this deep sense that God is still with them. And my dad especially, that God is going to teach him something new today that he's never heard before. And he's excited about that. And we are the victims of been there, done that, and we need to be instead saying, yeah, I've been there, done that, I've seen a lot, but God has something new to teach me today. God has a new mercy for me today. Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, you have provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Amen.